Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. We are your two usually unusual hosts, Clark Coffey and Colin McFader. Of course, I'm Colin. Clark down there in California.
Down
How's it
there.
going?
I'm down there. I'm down
Yeah,
here.
way down there.
Way down there. Yeah, man. Life is good, man. It's a hot summer afternoon, but I'm pretty cool here in my home.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to be with you once again, as they say up there in Canada, for the discussion on this film that was my choice. But I don't want to introduce it because I don't want to take that away from you.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So the movie that you chose this week is Embrace of the Serpent. It is directed by Ciro Guerra.
Yeah, 2015.
Apologize for if I butchered the pronunciation of that and many other things I assume during this episode. I probably will.
You know, you did. We do our best. We do our best,
exactly.
Sometimes we mispronounce things, and sometimes maybe even our ideas are cuckoo. But you know what? They're ours, and
yes, nobody can take that away from us.
We're just here having fun, talking about movies. I mean, so how serious could it really be? But yes, no.
Yeah, so this one came out in 2015.
2015.
It was kind of a festival
Colombian
movie. I don't think it got too much of a wide release. I remember it playing at the TIFF Lightbox in Toronto, not for the festival, but just regularly. And
right.
So I do vaguely remember it coming out, but I hadn't seen it, and I don't believe you'd seen it till this week.
No, I hadn't seen it either, and I wasn't even aware of it on release. And it's as much as I love films, I mean, a lot of them slip through the cracks for me. There's just only so much time, only so many films I can see, even though I feel like I see quite a few. But yeah, this one, I don't recall this one being released near me, although living in Southern California, I'm sure it probably was somewhere. I hope it was somewhere, because I think it's certainly deserving of a theatrical release, although it wouldn't be wide, of course. But yeah, like you said, it did get a lot of traction in the festival circuit. And I mean, it even actually, it was submitted by Columbia for the Best Foreign Language Film at the 88th Academy Awards.
Yep.
So, and it was included among the final 5 nominees, and it was the first Colombian film to receive a nomination for the Academy Awards. So, I mean, that's pretty decent visibility there. But yeah, it still nonetheless escaped me. And, who knows if I even watched the Academy Awards at that point. But I just had no recollection of it. But how I came to it to recommend it for this was that my wife actually saw it on a plane, and she recommended it to me. And I was like, okay, well, I'll check it out. But I wanted to watch it first. So I actually watched it first. And then I thought, yeah, you know what? I think this would be a really interesting film to discuss on the podcast. And I thought it was kind of especially interesting because I felt like it had some parallels to some of our previous discussions with Herzog. And of course, his notorious time in the Amazon, right? I mean, that's,
whether for several movies.
My Best Fiend, and of course, Aguirre, Wrath of God, Fitzcarraldo, all 3 of those films we discussed early on in this podcast's history. And so I thought, hey, this will be kind of just an interesting circle back to some of the same cinematic landscapes that we discussed in those first films. So yeah, but you're right. My first viewing as well, and what we always kind of like to do to start off our discussion on the films is to kind of talk about our personal experiences with the film. And so, Colin, if you don't mind, kind of share what your just kind of, initial experience viewing the film was.
Yeah, I mean, So I didn't really know much about what it was about at all. Again, I vaguely remember seeing the trailer for it back in 2015, but nothing stuck with, I don't really remember what the trailer even was, and so I didn't watch it prior to watching this. Just figured I would go in with, completely unbiased. And I think the first thing that really jumped out to me is how it doesn't. You have obviously anytime you watch a movie and kind of get the gist of what it's about in a vague sense. I knew it was about the Amazon and kind of like a journey in the Amazon. I just didn't really know the specifics of it. So you kind of go in with a level of expectation as to what that means, because of course there have been plenty of movies that are about, if not a journey on the Amazon River, journeys upriver in a jungle, whether it's,
Sure.
Apocalypse Now or even just stories in general, Heart of
Heart
Darkness,
of
and
Darkness, of
of
course,
course,
yeah. Or
Herzog's
even
work, like
what
you mentioned,
right, right.
and
And
in
it's
fact,
even kind
a
of
great,
a kinship to the road, like a road trip movie, like
yes, exactly, yeah,
the like the North
yeah,
American version. The Canadian, the American, like our version would be the road trip film, right?
yeah, where you
You know,
have all these vignettes along the way
but
of
it's
these little
even
stories, yeah,
and even goes so far back, and I'm sure before this, but the earliest, I mean, even something like Canterbury Tales was,
yeah,
they think this was written in the 1400s, was basically a series of vignettes and stories, this group of people along a journey. So
yeah, yeah.
obviously a super common thematic element,
Yeah,
thematic
and then
theme.
especially,
Yeah.
especially it being in the jungle, you kind of have expectations of what that's
Mm.
going to entail. So that I expected things like dealing with bugs or animals or that kind of thing. And what I
I feel
think
like you need to
took me
go into
aback from
Herzog
this,
voice now. You need to
yes,
go into
yeah,
Herzog,
the
where
insanity of the jungle,
I just
the
always have
Jungles.
that scene where he's being interviewed, and is it My Best Fiend? Is that where he's
I think it's from that, yeah, yeah,
it
and he's
and
discussing the, yeah,
where it's like the behind the scenes, it's like BTS footage of him, shooting with Kinski doing Fitzcarraldo, where he's just discussing like how it's like the birds aren't singing, they're like screaming in
yeah,
agony.
yeah, and it's
Yeah.
like the internal chaos of the jungle consuming itself. But you don't.
Okay, sorry.
What
Yeah.
I think is
Yep.
interesting about this, though, is that you don't really get that kind of
Mm-mm.
sensationalizing, like that. There is
No.
no in this movie. There's no sequence of them falling in the river and a crocodile. Like, I know that sounds sort of cheesy, but a lot of these movies they
No, but it's what
kind
it
of do
is. A lot
include
of them
that, or
are.
like there's like a
Yep.
panther or a tiger. Of course, there are
Yep.
animals featured in the film, but they're used more as a symbolism for
Yeah.
what the film is trying to say, as opposed to, you don't have like a scene where they're sitting around the campfires and someone's complaining about all the bugs,
Well,
and things like that. You don't get that kind of it almost treats the jungle as a
yeah.
very respectful
Or even it's
being,
just not
as
the
opposed
focus.
to, yeah,
Not
yeah,
that I want to steal your, but you're bringing up such interesting things. I know we're still kind of discussing your viewing experience, but just if you'll bear with me here for a moment. I mean, I think
hmm,
because you sparked an idea here. I think like just from the get go with the cinematography, right? We have a black and white cinematography that just immediately kind of plays against what you would normally like. We don't have any huge establishing shots where we've got,
hmm,
these large landscapes of the Amazon jungle, and it's like we're just overwhelmed with saturated green, right? We don't, and you're right, there's not, we don't, a lot of times it'd be like this large Amazonian landscape, and then we'd cut in on some like inserts of like, animals, and the plants just like overwhelming the frame. But this is shot in such a way where the Amazon is actually kind of, I mean, this could have been shot on. It kind of takes away the alienness of the landscape. Is
yeah,
almost what I
yeah.
feel, because it's not from that perspective, like you're saying. So sorry, I just wanted to. I just
No,
had
no,
that kind
no
of thought.
worries.
But even from the beginning of the, the way the way the jungle is framed, the way the river is framed, the way the photography is set, it's it's just so matter of fact. It's like,
Yeah,
well, yeah,
yeah,
we're in the Amazon, but this is home.
yeah,
This is not an
exactly.
alien landscape. Yeah.
And even you get the idea that even, of course, the just a brief kind of idea of what the structure of the movie is, that the it's set about two journeys up the Amazon River
Mm-hmm.
in Colombia, separated by 30 years. So the first
Yep.
one is set in the kind of like around 1910-ish, and
Mm-hmm.
the second one, of course, is set in the 1940s,
Yeah.
or like right at 1940, just at the beginning of
Yeah.
the Second World War. And so these two timelines kind of coincide with the two major Amazon rubber cycles, is what they're called, and it's kind of like a
Yeah.
rush to get rubber from
Extract. Yeah. Rubber
Colombia. Yeah,
extraction. Yeah.
and so you have these two stories, and but again, you don't, like with our story that takes place earlier is about a ethnologist
Mm-hmm.
named
Theo from
Theo.
Germany.
Yeah, he's
Yep.
from Germany. He's a real guy, but the film is not like a super accurate retelling, but it's inspired by the diaries that these two explorers kind of made this
Yeah.
set time apart. But you don't get this idea that like Theo is even like, he doesn't seem like he's out of place in the jungle in a sense. Like he's not like there are a few moments where he like, he can't necessarily paddle the boat well and things like that. Like he certainly has that element to him, but he's
Hmm.
not like, oh my God, a bat. And, it's not like Willie Scott running around in Temple of Doom with like a snake on
Right,
her and
right.
stuff.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
so you don't even have this, everyone kind of just it seems very tame. Like it's presenting the jungle as a character for sure, but it's not presenting it as its kind of usual typecast of this big, scary, horrifying,
Sensationalized. It's not
consuming.
sensationalized.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Which I thought, that immediately kind of stuck out to me
Yeah.
as something that was interesting and something that was unique about it. And again,
Yeah.
like you said, that is taken very literally in the way that it's shot, black and white photography and all that. Um, but yeah, and so what is interesting about that too is that you immediately get this sense that, or at least I immediately got this sense that as we are going along and seeing these vignettes, that the circumstances are so much more about the human characters involved in these moments and
Hmm.
not about, the jungle is almost like an innocent bystander that is being hurt through
Mm.
this, like the exploitation that the movie kind of explores, rather than, sort of like a man versus nature style of thing. And so you end up with all these vignettes that are very much based around what humans are doing to other humans and how humans are
Mm.
controlling and how humans are bastardizing the nature and the plants and things like that to
Or
um
impacting each other even.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Maybe less even, because I think that is, I again, not to, but just real quickly here to jump in. I mean, it's certainly there's the element of the kind of the resource extraction and maybe the abuse of the area, but at least the sense that I got when I was watching it, it was far from the main focus. That it was rather, a very interpersonal story, or a very
Yeah.
intimate story about the impacts that individual humans have on each other when we have either collisions of cultures or colonization, resource extraction, or even just the passage of time and how that impacts us. Or, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I think that there's a lot of interesting layers, which was something that really jumped out to me when I saw it. But please, I'll hand it back to you though as you continue. But yeah,
Yeah, no, so I thought that it just that immediately made it interesting to me, that this idea that it's
yeah,
not just kind of sensationalizing the dangers of the jungle and nature and things like that, and then it tells a much more kind of human story, um, and treats almost the humans in it as you never. I mean, there were a few moments where you have sort of these minor antagonists. I almost want to say like they're antagonists for
mm,
really just the scenes that they're in.
yeah,
Um, and even in those instances, it's not like you're ever given some sort of monologue to understand why we shouldn't like this person or why what they're doing is
yeah,
wrong. It just kind of very matter of factly shows what's going on, and it treats it in a very, very nuanced kind of moral, almost understanding of what is happening, not
empathetic,
necessarily condoning,
yeah,
yeah, but
yeah,
certainly being, empathizing with um this, and even takes it to an extent that, because of course these stories are set 30 years apart, but there is one character that appears in both stories who is kind of the guide, the indigenous guide,
the
Kara
shaman,
Makate. Yeah, he's a
Karamakate,
shaman
yeah,
for a
yep,
tribe that he believes has been wiped out. But
yeah,
you actually see the events and the choices that they made on their first journey, or on the first journey, with the results and the consequences of those
yeah,
choices later, 30 years later, and which is very interesting because it also kind of shows this idea that, Kara McCall, like it. I think one thing that it really shies away from, that I think is really, really important and really nuance, again kind of emphasizes that nuance, is
mm,
this trope of like the noble savage that is
right.
comes up so frequently when you have stories about indigenous, really anything, and even
From
beyond
a
just
Western
indigenous stories.
perspective, yeah, from the
Exactly.
Western perspective, it
You'll have
often is the case. Yes,
a
yeah,
Western filmmaker who will come in and kind of, for whatever reason, there's a million reasons that
yeah,
it's been done, but and some certainly better than others, but um, you have this kind of, yeah, this trope of making it that the indigenous people are kind of seen as this two-dimensional, like one
yeah,
with
like
nature,
right,
and it's a very, I think, ultimately a harmful trope, because again it kind
sure,
of compresses an entire culture with nuance
Well,
and
it
and
limits the humanity to just a
complications to
single, yeah,
yeah
it
to a
just
single
limits their
idea.
humanity,
And
right?
so with that, I mean, I think that you kind of get the sense that even this character Karamakate, who again is this shaman, makes those mistakes and kind of has to come across the consequences of those mistakes later on, and
Mm,
that it challenges his idea of, sure, maybe he has an answer to Evan or Theo's issues, that the problems that they're facing as people, he tries to sort of help them with, or at least show them a way. But then he also kind of comes into his own way where he says like, well,
mm,
or at least thinks, am I is what am I doing that's correct here, and how am I
mm.
actually impacting these people? And so it kind of asks those questions, which is very interesting to me.
Yeah.
And again, it's just the nuance in that kind of writing is really what stuck out to me. But what was
Yeah.
your first impression? Let's hear about
Yeah, no,
yours.
that's
Now that I
good.
went
That's
on a
good.
long-winded.
I No, that's perfect. I'm glad that you had such a like interest, a complex like reaction to it. I mean, that's regardless of whether you like the film or not like the film, to have a complex reaction to it, I feel like is the best compliment. I mean, if I,
Mhm.
that's what I would hope as a filmmaker for sure. Um, yeah, I mean, so much of what you said, I think, resonated with me too. I mean, I think I was, I think with many films, I initially I'm impacted by the cinematography, right? Because it's right there in front of you immediately. And I think, and I just kind of discussed how I was kind of taken by the choice of using black and white cinematography and kind of just skipping all the tropes that we had just talked about how a Western film, or especially whether it's like even Herzog's films, or Apocalypse Now, this like really kind of emphasizing the alienness of the Amazon landscape, right? The
Mhm.
having this film be so devoid of all of that, and that we immediately start in a very intimate place where we're meeting the young Karamakate. That really struck me. And it's actually a really beautiful shot that we kind of start with, where we kind of push in on him, and there's this reveal. I mean, right off the bat, we have Theo is revealed, and as the kind of comes up in the canoe, and we see that he's sick. And Manduka, which I don't think is a character. Have we talked about Manduka yet? But he's a
No,
really
not really.
important
No, yeah.
character. Yeah, he's an extremely important character. He's been traveling with Theo, and basically, we kind of learn throughout the film that Theo had basically saved or released Manduka from a rubber plantation. From basically enslavement there. And so Manduka has now become his guide and assistant, and is actually quite loyal and defends Theo actually throughout the film, which becomes kind
Mhm.
of some like moments of friction between him and Karamakate, because Karamakate is like, "Hey, why in the world are you helping this white man? Like they bring nothing but death and destruction to our land. Why are you
Mhm.
helping him?" And it's definitely one of the mechanisms through which I think the filmmaker tries to interject some of that nuance and complexity that you're talking about, that moral complexity, which is important. So I think I was just immediately kind of captured by that, right? Um, and so we have the introduction of all these characters in that earlier time frame, like you said, around 1909, 1910. Now we don't know this at the time, but we learn it later. And then we have a
Mhm.
credit sequence, and then now we jump right into another timeline. So I was like, ooh, okay, we're gonna have like two timelines here. This is interesting. And it took me, I'll admit, because I'm very slow, and I'm kind of focused on ooh, the pretty cinematography. and
Yes. Yeah.
sometimes and sometimes I'm a little slow. Like I have to admit, sometimes I'll be watching a film, and if I'm watching it with my wife, I'll have to pause or interrupt the film, which is like, I'm sorry, wife. Um, but if, and I'll be like, wait, what's going on? Sometimes
Yeah.
I
No, I
lose the,
get that. I understand that.
I miss these like really simple plot cues sometimes. So but we come into the second timeline, like you said, in the 1940s, where now we have this second white traveler. His name's Evan, and he's American, and both travelers are in search of something. Theo is in search of basically a cure for, and we never really, the film doesn't go into this, but in real life, in his diaries, we know that he suffered and eventually died of malaria in the Amazon.
Mhm.
But he's clearly very ill, and him and Manduka are seeking some kind of cure or help for his illness. He's clearly like really direly sick. Um, And ultimately, what that means is that they're looking for a plant, right? They're looking
Hmm.
for medicine to cure him. Well, Evan is also looking for plant. Now, he's kind of a little duplicitous in that he's really actually kind of looking for a disease resistant rubber plant to take back to the United States to use in
Yeah,
a
because
war
the
effort for World
Second
War
World War,
II.
they used to get the rubber
Right.
from Southeast Asia. Obviously, that was kind of cut off when
So
the
they're trying
Japanese
to,
kind of expanded. Yeah.
right. So they were trying to kind of find ways to help increase their rubber production. But he also is though an entobiologist,
Hmm.
right? Did I get that right? Is
Yeah,
that what he
he's a
was?
botanist. Yeah.
A botanist, botanist.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. So Theo is
Entobotanist,
a
right?
ethnobiologist, and Evan is a
That
botanist.
there you
Yeah.
go. So they're both, so there is a certain level of like education and respect for where they are. It's not like Evan is just some, like agent of the government or
Hmm.
rubber company, and he's here to do, he is here to do this, but he's also a scholar and a scientist, and he's extremely interested and knowledgeable in the native plants that are here in the area. So he also is looking for. Now, they don't use the word ayahuasca in the film, but
Hmm.
ultimately, I think it's kind of clear to see that he's, I think, looking for ayahuasca as well, and trying to
Yeah. Yeah.
understand that, or even maybe experience it.
Well, because even
Um,
this character that he's based off of, which is his real name, this
y-
Evan,
did in
what was his
fact
full name?
actually wrote
Yeah,
books
Richard
on,
Evans Schultz. He
yeah,
actually did wrote a book, co-wrote a book with the German inventor chemist of
of
LSD, or
LSD,
Swiss,
right?
sorry.
Yeah,
He clearly later in his life became interested in that stuff, or continued an interest in
yeah,
it. So that
yeah.
doesn't really
So
come up much in, like, it's not about him figuring out the key to
no, no. But
this,
there's this
but it is,
complexity of
yeah,
motive,
important,
though,
and
which
it's
I found
important
interesting.
context. Yeah.
Yeah, but I just mean there's these complexity of motives, and and
Yes.
and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
and which just kind of speaks a little more to what you were talking about the ethical complexity and nuance, and the nuance and complexity in the characters, as opposed to being simple tropes.
Yeah.
I noticed that too right away, and I was like very relieved, because it's kind of when you see that in a film, when it's like stereotypes and tropes, you're just kind of like, oh geez, this again.
Yeah, it becomes
um
immediately predictable, and yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's just not good storytelling, if nothing else. It's just not good storytelling. So generally speaking, I mean, look, there's places, goofy action movies, hey, yeah, of course, right?
We're
Like,
not looking for the nuance there.
well, yeah, generally speaking, stuff blows
Yeah.
up and whatever, and that's okay. But yeah. And so I was like very pleased to see that right away, and I was really kind of taken by this, what was going to be clear to kind of be some kind of dual timeline. And it was
Hmm.
also kind of clear that what you were, not only was it a dual timeline, but that you were going to see a journey, like you were going to see a journey that had very much had parallels, these physical parallels, that they're going to go down the river in the same way and go to some of these similar stops, but that they were going to be separated by 30 years, and that we were
Hmm.
going to see not just like a changed jungle or a changed river, a changed landscape through time, but you were also going to see, especially, and I found this was maybe the most compelling part to me, was the how Karamakate was changed.
Hmm.
Now, Karamakate is an extremely interesting character, and I think used really well by this filmmaker. And so this is, I think, maybe the biggest impact on me when I watched this, and it was the thing that kind of most had me interested to bring it to our podcast to discuss it. So Karamakate, I think, simultaneously is a fantastic symbol for what has happened to his culture, or
Yeah. Yeah.
to many of the cultures there. And so what I mean by that is that, he represents the last of his tribe, and the reason that his tribe is now reduced to him only, or at least he thinks, is of course because of the rubber extraction by
Hmm.
European powers, and the enslavement and basically near genocide of many of the peoples there, if not just full on genocide.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
But more nuanced than that, you also have a westernization, a colonization that's happened there. So even those people who are remaining, their cultures are being impacted and kind of overwhelmed by Western culture. And we see some of that by, there's a Spanish mission there where a priest is in charge basically of several dozen orphaned native, indigenous children, and
Hmm.
he actually denies them their language, and their, every aspect of their culture is denied as and is labeled as pagan, and they are disciplined like fiercely,
Hmm.
flogged if they display that culture, and they're forced to speak Spanish, and they're forced to live in the ways that this Spanish priest thinks they should. Um, so he represents, so it's interesting in the beginning, he's younger, he's 30 years younger, he's like very physically fit, he's strong, he's passionate, he's in command of his environment, we would say, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
He's and when we find him 30 years later as an old man, he's still dressed identically to the way he was in the beginning, but we can see now that he's no longer the stature of his self. He's 30 years older. He's more fragile, but more importantly, he's kind of going through the motions. We see him drawing on this large like rock face. He's these pictographs.
Hmm.
But when Evan asks him what he's drawing, and this is in their first meeting, he says he can't remember. He doesn't know. He can't recall, and
Hmm.
he is disconnected from his memories. And he actually, this is the first time we hear him kind of draw a metaphor, or kind of draw on this mythology of this creature that roams the jungle, that's like everybody has this mirror of themselves, this
Yeah.
but
The
but
second
this
person.
mirror,
That's yeah.
this second person, but the second person though is hollow, has no
Hmm.
dreams, has no memories, is hollow. And so he says, I think I am that. I'm no, I've turned into this. I have no memories, I have no dreams, I've disconnected. So symbolically, he kind of, I think it's a really effective like symbology to represent the disconnection, right? This culture, that the narrative thread has been cut, and now there is no memory of this culture from the past. But also on another level, on a more personal, individual level, I found it quite fascinating that he also represented, I think, what all of us to some extent probably will experience in our lives if we live long enough to
Hmm.
age. I found it quite fascinating that it's this, when we're younger, we're generally filled with dreams and filled with energy and passion. And as we age and we go through this journey, right? That there may be certain aspects of ourselves that we are cut off from, that we lose some of our dreams, or that we lose some of our memories, or that there's a real fear, right? Or a real
Hmm.
possibility that that can happen.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think there was that too, that it doesn't have to even necessarily be so symbolic, that it's, well, symbolic but just in a different level. So that was extremely compelling to me.
Hmm. Yeah. No, me
That
too.
really,
Yeah.
that yeah, that really captivated me in this film, and I have to say I was like pretty emotionally impacted by that.
Hmm.
Surprisingly so, actually. I think by the time I got to the end of the film, and I find this, sometimes with films that are really a cut above, um, that because there's some films, right, you watch and they're quite saccharine and they're like manipulative, and yes, you're like laughing and crying, and you get to the end of it, and it's nothing as a surprise. You're totally aware of how you're feeling and why you're feeling it, and you know exactly what the filmmaker did to make you feel that way, and you've kind of gone through the motions, and you've had this experience, and that's all well and good, and that's fine, but there's no surprise there, right? There's
Hmm.
other
Yeah.
films though, I feel like, where I get to the end of them and it's like I don't know why exactly I feel the way I feel. Like I
Yeah.
really have to sit in it and think about it. And like, whoa, I'm actually surprised I am that emotionally impacted.
Hmm.
And and generally speaking, to me, for me personally, that's a really big indicator, um, at least in my eyes, of a quality film.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those were the things that really jumped out to me in my viewing experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think the use of no, I'm forgetting his name again.
Karamakate?
Karamakate as the
Yeah.
through line, where
Mm-hmm.
there's almost no. I mean, of course, Evan is aware of Theo's journey and is there
Well,
because he read
well,
his book,
I was
but
going to say
the
he actually has. Evan actually has. I just
yeah,
want
the
to
book
interject
that
real
yeah yeah
quickly because I think it's an interesting note in the film, and that is that Evan actually has. So Theo actually he's got this journal, and
mm-hmm,
he's right, basically a diary, and he's drawing images of all the people that he's seen and their face paintings or clothing and plants and insect, all this stuff, right? He's kind of making notes of all these things, and of course that's what Evan has with him and is kind of using as a guide in this second trip down the Amazon with Karamakate 30 years later.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's using these kind of just like again that I think it's no coincidence that they changed because in real life in the nonfiction version of this story, Theo died
Mm,
much later. He died in the 20s, early 20s, in the Amazon, so similar
right.
fashion, but died after
Yeah.
the end of the first kind of rubber boom in the Amazon.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that one of the things that they did that's really smart in breaking away from that is you then in doing so kind of present this, I think, very very fundamental point in South American, but especially Colombian history, and you distill it into human relationships and human interaction between very few people, and so you
Yeah.
represent it in a much more not necessarily simple in a negative sense, but in a sense that you understand motivations on a personal basis rather than
Yeah.
trying to. I mean, you never even see in this movie, as far as I'm aware and as far as I can remember, and I just watched it yesterday, so I think I remember pretty well. You don't ever see a plantation owner or like a
Nope.
Colombian soldier. You hear them and you
Yep.
hear conversation about them, and there's kind of this impression a few times that they could be right around the corner. But
Right. Right.
rather than taking what I think is again a very fundamental point in this country, all of these different cultures' history, and kind of blowing it up into an epic and saying like, look at this. This is this incredible run of rubber, this rush of fortunes that like a gold rush kind of thing, right? And you
Yeah.
present it. You could present so easily could
Well,
present this story that way, and yet
I think
in
there's always the temptation, right, to kind of try to
yeah,
show scale. I think, and
hmm
and look, I think that's definitely got value, right? Because there was scale to this. It wasn't something that just happened in a few places. I mean, you know, countless lives were impacted by this.
yeah, yeah,
Entire countries and entire regions and entire tribes and cultures were impacted. So there is a scope. You're right. I mean,
yeah.
there is a scope, but they chose to kind of come at it the other angle, which
Yeah, well, and the
is
film doesn't necessarily hide the
intimate.
scope. Like it
Yeah,
doesn't present it, but it also, I mean, every single indigenous person we meet along the journey has something to say about plantations or rubber, the harvesting of rubber. So it's very clear. The movie makes it very clear that this is something that affects the people, even the
yeah,
furthest, most isolated communities deep in this
yeah,
jungle that are only accessible by a 3 days journey on a boat. Um,
yeah,
and it really kind of emphasizes how far reaching these consequences are, but it doesn't necessarily present it in a kind of big cinematic
epic. Yeah,
grand kind of fashion. And I think that also makes the final moments or the final few moments of the movie very impactful, where the whole movie is not only is it just set in the jungle, but we spend the entire film on the jungle floor or on a
hmm
river in flat jungle
and
landscapes. We're
and
never
really
above the
intimate framing.
canopy.
It's
Yeah, very
really
intimate
intimate
framing,
framing. We're
longer
very, yeah,
lenses. I mean, a few wide stuff, but primarily
not
if it's
much.
wide, it's very close to the characters.
It, yep.
So you're always, the characters are always filling the frame. You never are really presenting these characters on a backdrop of a massive vista or something like that.
Mm-mm.
Like it's always very, in a sense, kind of claustrophobic. Like every turn of the river looks the same as the last 10. And so you never really have this sense of where you are geographically. And so it really puts you into that headspace of what it would likely have been like to actually be making this journey, because you just have no idea where you are, how far along you are, where the nearer, like when the next time you're going to come across any sense of civilization. But then when the final moments of the movie, when when Karamakate actually brings Evan to the kind of original blooming or sprouting place of this fictional but representative of, like,
which is
ayahuasca kind of psychedelic plant.
and
It's
just to
the only. Oh
provide
yeah, yeah.
context, it's the remnants of Karamakate's tribe that he thought was lost. Right. This is what you're
Yeah, well,
talking
so
about.
that's when Theo and them arrive. But I
Oh,
mean,
sorry.
yeah,
You're
yeah.
talking about the very end.
So
Okay,
the
my apologies.
with the only
When they're
time
on
we
the
actually get
dome, the
up
rock
is,
dome.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, yeah, is the only time we get above the canopy is when Theo kind of, or sorry, not Theo, when Karamakate brings Evan up to
yeah.
experience this, you know, it's kind of a, what do they call it, a like a spirit journey or whatever. I can't remember
Totally.
what
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
specific
Yes.
word for it is, but and it's the only time that we actually are, both our characters are above the canopy, and then we cut to footage from what I assume is a helicopter or drone or something above the
You're
canopy.
thinking like
And
Vision Quest, like a Vision
vision,
Quest. Is
yes,
that what you
exactly,
were? Yeah,
exactly. And
yeah.
so I think it's really brilliant in the way that it kind of juxtaposes those two things, where we have spent the entire film, because Theo and the characters, they're the end of their journey has a much more, if not explicitly tragic, dour kind of tone. Like, it's not a very,
Yeah.
the I think that the brilliant part about these two things and how differently these two stories are kind of from each other, how Karamakate is so different from his young self as an old guy, even just in the way that he introduces themselves to these
Mm.
Westerners that are coming in that,
Well,
in the
yeah.
young Karamakate is immediately standoffish and aggressive and kind of defensive, and
Right.
says, like, get away, and he threatens to they have the blow dart thing, and he's threatening to,
Well,
um
and the
you
only
know
reason he agrees to assist is that Theo basically says, "Hey, I have actually seen your tribe. There
yeah,
are other members of your tribe left alive. I know where they are. I can take you there."
yeah,
So that's
yeah.
really that's the only reason that Karamakate, young Karamakate, agrees to assist and go along in this journey.
And of course, the end of that journey, the first journey, is him arriving at the remnants of his tribe and realizing that, yeah, they've completely bastardized this,
Yeah,
what is a very
the
sacred,
sacred plant. Yeah,
plant that his tribe has kind of started using as a recreational drug in a lot of senses, and kind of
almost just
being.
like alcohol. It's
Yeah,
almost like a
exactly.
parallel to like they're just kind of drunkenly just yeah, like it's an
Yeah.
escape as opposed to a like a ceremonial, an important respected ceremonial journey or
And
experience or
that
medicine.
clearly
Yeah.
makes him that clearly affects him profoundly, because he burns down the tree, and that's kind of the last time we
Hmm.
see the young him, is him standing within the flames, and sort of. And then, of course,
Right.
Theo and Manduka run off as the Colombian army comes in. But I think what it also does, what at least the impression I got and the interpretation I kind of took away from it, is that when we end the film with Evan actually finally getting to this spot, and
Hmm.
Karamakate actually destroying the final tree, but in a much different tone. He's not vengeful, and he's not, angry. He kind of, it's almost like he's finally reached this place where they've successfully broken down these divisions between the two of them, and that they, despite the fact they've come from completely different cultures and lives and led entirely different lives and even have different motivations for being right there. I mean, there's even the moment when Evan kind of has this feeble attempt at, like, kind of threatening him with a knife, and Kermakate just does not
Hmm.
even really acknowledge it. Um, that you see Kermakate kind of almost, for lack of a better term, like ascend when Evan
Hmm.
has this psychedelic experience from the plant, and it's almost like that was his, that he was misinterpreting what his real task was, or
Hmm.
what his purpose was, and that his purpose now, or what he realizes, that his purpose is kind of preserving this culture as something that can't be, if it's gone, it can't be corrupted, in that sort of sense. Like, there's a kind of this overarching um, conversation that's had, especially from Manduka throughout, with in regards to Theo, but I think Evan kind of represents the same idea that, our cultures are dying, we're being rooted out of the jungle by these plantations, and our people are being stolen. And if they're not stolen to work on plantations, then they're stolen by these kind of residential schools and converted to Catholics and are
Mm-hmm.
westernized. And these guys, of course, Manduka is talking about Theo, but in a general sense, these researchers are a way of us preserving our culture, and that this he's writing down, he's respected back home, and he's going to go show them that we're not the impression that Europeans have of us. We're not, these stereotypes and these caricatures, that we have culture and nuance, and so Manduka in a lot of ways kind of approaches it as this preservation in a historical or a literary sense. And I think that the ending of the film is kind of realizing the bridge between those two things, and that you have Manduka, who is this westernized indigenous person that is supporting Theo on his journey, and we have the young Karamakate, who is resilient and resistant to what is happening, and is kind of going along because he's been enticed by this promise of seeing again his tribe he assumed was extinct. And so then when we finally get to the point where Evan and old Karamakate are having this kind of experience together, that you do sort of get this sense that, yeah, it's like you're bridging these two ideas together, in that it's almost like an acceptance of the world being the way it is, but at the same time bringing somebody else on that kind of journey and showing them, changing them. Evan changes almost as
Mm-hmm.
much as Karamakate. So
Well, absolutely.
yeah, so there's
Certainly.
yeah, so it's a really
I like
interesting, I
this.
think, nuanced ending that
Yeah.
that comes up with this,
I mean,
not necessarily middle ground. Like, I don't want to pretend it's like, oh, it's, neither sides are right, but it's more that it takes it a step further, in the sense that it's like you kind of have to ascend beyond these very extra, or what's external differences, in order to
well, yeah.
preserve these kind of, like,
Boy,
these beautiful things in life. And
yeah, yeah, yeah. There are things that transcend. Boy, you've sparked a lot of thoughts in me. I mean, I think, one of the things that really stands out to me in this film is that it's empathetic and it's nuanced, and in the treatment of all of its characters, which I really appreciate. Um, and I mean, I think it's for me where I see so much of that, but it's you see it in all the characterizations, all the characters, but it's also in these vignettes, right, in both timelines as we go down the river. It's we have in our first timeline, in the first place that we stop, Theo and Manduka and young Karamakate stop at this small village, and there's a tribe there that Theo and Manduka know. They know each other. They've obviously spent time there, and they're very friendly. And so they have like a really relaxed, nice evening there. Where, matter of fact, even Theo and Manduka perform in front of the village, and you actually
mhm.
see young Karamakate laugh, and is actually it's a first, he kind of has a break in the wall that he's presented to those characters, which I thought was really a sweet moment in the film, an intimate and sweet moment. But in this vignette, you have when they're leaving the next day. So Theo has kind of shown the village his compass and explained what it does and how it works. When he's leaving, he realizes his compass is missing. And
Mhm.
so right before they get back on the canoe to head back out on the river, he approaches the small tribe and says, "Hey, does somebody have my compass? I don't have it, and we really need it." And ultimately, they kind of, play dumb a little bit, and then eventually they try to give him gifts as an exchange, and he says, I don't want to exchange. I really need the compass. And he gets really frustrated and angry, and even kind of starts to manhandle, one of the younger villagers. And finally, Karamakate, they're like, okay, we'll leave. We need to leave. And Theo is like, I really need to get that compass. If I leave it here, and we don't know exactly what he's going to say. And I found this was interesting. He says, "Hey, if we leave the compass here, it's going to replace the ways that they understand to navigate. They navigate by the winds and the stars, and if we leave this compass, they will forget and lose those abilities.
Yeah, it's like a rapid
And
acceleration of technology kind of thing.
and then young Kiramakate says, well, who are you to decide what knowledge they can or can't have? Knowledge is for all mankind, all humanity. And so it's interesting that, they are both in parts right, of course, um, and maybe wrong, too, in equal parts, but that it's a nuanced question, right? And that it is a really challenging situation. We have another moment um, where it's Manduka and Theo and young Kermakate again, and they come upon this area in the jungle where it's clear that someone is harvesting latex from the rubber trees.
Hmm.
And Manduka, having been recently released, from basically, slavery, right, or in a rubber plantation, is like really triggered and grabs all the buckets and starts overthrowing them and spilling all the latex out onto the jungle floor. And I mean, is obviously like extremely emotionally affected by this when he sees this. And as soon as he's done doing that, we have this character, is like this one armed, like clearly he's had like an arm that
Clearly
appears to have been
severely being beaten and
like cut
tortured and stuff.
off.
Yeah, yeah.
His face is disfigured and mangled. He's got this makeshift like cast on one of his legs. He can hardly
Hmm.
walk. And he's, he comes into this little clearing or this area where the trees were being harvested. And, he's trying to like just totally fruitlessly, trying to scrape the latex back up off the jungle floor and put it back in the um, buckets. And he starts like yelling something to them, and Manduka's like, can you translate this, Karamakate? And he's like, he's saying, kill me, kill me. So
Hmm.
basically, now that all this latex has been spilled, he knows that when the plantation owners or the company people come back, they're going to either torture or who knows what they'll do to him. It'll be horrible, and we can only imagine just by looking at his body already what he's had to endure. And so Manduka runs and grabs a rifle and comes back, saying, I can't, there's no way I can put him through this. And, or, this hell that he's going to experience if I leave him here. But he's, even knowing that, he can't bring himself
Hmm.
to kill this man. He can't bring himself to do it. So they leave. And as they leave, we see this man, kind of this one last, like, just such a sad silhouette on the bank of the river at the edge of the jungle. And as soon as as they move away from this location, we hear, screaming and gunfire.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so it's just this, this road to hell is paved with good intent. I don't even know what it is, right? It's not even the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's just that the impacts that our actions have on people that we or things that we just have no idea how this, it's like, obviously Manduka did not have any intention to, not only did he have no intention to harm this man, I mean, he completely sympathized with this person as
Yeah.
having been
Yeah.
in this situation himself, but yet he is the instrument in a strange way of this man's death.
Yeah.
And I don't know. And even then, do we take that as a release? Do we take that as a good thing or a bad thing? I don't even know. So that kind of, at least to me, and maybe I'm simple, but that kind of complexity presented in such an efficient way in a film is just extremely compelling. I mean, we have also the moment where they arrive at the Spanish mission in the first timeline. And here we see this basically sadistic Spanish priest in charge over, several dozen orphaned indigenous children. And like I said before, he's basically labeled all of their indigenous culture as pagan, right?
Hmm.
And is trying to teach them his culture. And ultimately, what happens is that Manduka sees the priest beating one of the children, comes, and I think he and then kills the priest, basically, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and now here they are. There's this group of children. They're at at this mission. They've got no adult there, and they kind of have this discussion briefly before they leave between Theo and Kiramakate and Maduka, where it's like, well, what do we do? We can't take them with us. We have no way to take them with us. If we leave them here, they will likely die or be killed. and so they just have to leave. And here they've left these
And they
children.
basically tell
Are
the kids
they
run off into the
well?
jungle, basically, right?
Are they better off? Are they worse off? Are they?
Yeah.
Is it neither? We don't. You know, um, we don't know. There is no simple answer.
Hmm.
There are complex questions and certainly no simple answers. And of course, when we come back to this mission 30 years later in the second timeline, and now when we've come back with Evan, there's these adults, and the mission of course is totally degraded and decrepit, and you could interpret this as that these are these orphans grown up, or you could interpret it that perhaps there's a different group of people who've moved into the mission. My interpretation was that it was these children grown up,
Yeah, yeah.
um, and they had stayed there, and they had taken these so strange aspects of their own culture. And Karamakati actually says it's the worst of both worlds,
Hmm.
where the children have taken parts of their own culture and have been like and parts of the Catholic priest culture, and kind of mesh them together in this perversion that is this strange cult where one of the men thinks he's Jesus, and he's
And
got
the man who
this.
thinks he's Jesus is clearly a outsider. Like he clearly is a I think he's supposed to be like a Brazilian. So, like he's not. I believe, as far as I could tell, that he kind of came and almost like took over as this
It's possible. I
Messiah.
missed that. I missed that, but totally possible. Totally possible. But that's an interesting interpretation. And that completely could have been what was conveyed, and maybe that had just escaped me in it. But but here they are. We have old Karamakate, and he basically this man who says he's Jesus. He's got this like child bride who's ill, and he asks Karamakate to cure her, seeing that he's a shaman, and he does, at least to some extent, enough that it convinces them that she's cured. And so there's this huge celebration, and they're basically abusing the ayahuasca as an inebriant instead of as a medicine.
Hmm.
And Karamak, and they ask him uh, to partake, and Karamakate is like no, and ultimately Karamakate poisons their large batch of ayahuasca, and they leave this group of people for dead, almost in the same way they left those children basically for dead in the first timeline. And now you're wondering, was this, what is the moral complexity of this,
Hmm.
what they've
Hmm.
done. So I just found at every turn, and like you said, at the end, when we get to the end of the second timeline with Evan, and Karamakate has taken him to the top of this dome where there's the last remaining flower, and he actually, makes the medicine for Evan, and you're right, and Evan kind of has this moment where, at first Karamakate is like refusing, him now, and Evan's like, I'm gonna get what I need come hell or high water, and he tries to kind of pull out a knife on him. But we see Karamakate kind of that vigor and that strength come back, and immediately just overtakes Evan, right? Evan doesn't really have too much fight in him in comparison. And
Hmm.
ultimately Karamakate shares the medicine with Evan. And then we have the only moments of color in the entire film, which is this. It's all I kind of thought of, it reminded me of almost like the 2001 moment, but
Hmm.
it's this beautiful color kaleidoscopic, um like abstract moments, this representation of this vision quest, like you said, where he's on this journey on the ayahuasca, and then when he awakens from this journey, or kind of returns from this inner journey, he's left alone on that rock dome, and no sign of Karamakate. We have no idea where he went. But it just to kind of speak to what you had talked about, this transformation in Karamakate at the end. I mean, he says very specifically, he says, I thought that my goal was to teach my people this medicine. But in reality, what I realized, my goal was to share this with you so that you could take it.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so we're left at the very end after this vision quest, and Evan kind of comes down off the mountain alone. Now the last shot is really beautiful. He's standing at the bank of the Amazon, and there's these surrounded by butterflies. And we had seen previously early in the film that Karamakate, there's a moment that almost kind of in passing, and we don't, and of course we don't realize the significance until we come to this moment at the end with Evan. But
Hmm.
Karamakate is surrounded by these white butterflies fluttering around him on the bank of the Amazon. And so we kind of, the symbolic representation of the culture being transmitted ultimately from the shaman who held it indigenously to Evan, which was quite
Hmm.
beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that it definitely it approaches again. I mean, we've used the word nuance so many times in this, but I think it definitely approaches all these things in a very human and again like very interpersonal way that these ideas are representative of a much larger systems and much larger events and things like that, and yet when you present them in a sense that you can immediately digest these ideas because you're understanding the dynamic between these two people or these three people in the case of the earlier voyage. I think the film does like a really brilliant job of just um, putting those ideas to very human, which I think is also, I mean, I also want to specify that it's not, and I sort of touched on this earlier, but it's not done conversationally. Like it's like so little is
Mm-hmm.
revealed through explicit conversation in
Yep.
this movie.
Thank
Um,
God.
they have conversation about the exactly, yeah, but it's like so much of this. I think one of the reasons that I think we have, and I think this has been a very fun element of this conversation, has been that we are kind of almost like filling each other in on each other's interpretations, and the reason that
Mm.
that is the case is because it's never very explicit. It's never really explicitly saying anything with these very, very simple and clear words. Like you don't get Karamakate sitting down with Evan and saying like, "Well, here now I'm going to pass my knowledge onto you through this," or even Manduka saying, "Oh, you know what? I worked on one of these plantations and I was tortured and abused, and this is why I'm throwing out the rubber here." And and it's so you end
It's
up
so sad
with
that we even have to. It's so sad that we even have
yes,
to
have to specify that
mention.
that's a good thing. Yeah. But I mean, you do end up with, and I think that this is a style of filmmaking and a style of storytelling that would have been commonplace,
Hmm.
and in a certain era of filmmaking, which I think we both very much enjoy. The
Well, look, it would have been common. It would have been commonplace during the entire silent film era. It would
yeah,
have been,
yeah,
I mean,
and so you get.
I.
But yeah, just this. I think that the style. I think that's one of the reasons that stuck out to me so much, and I think that that's also one of the reasons that again we've kind of briefly touched on this
Mm,
Herzogian element to it, which
yeah.
is very present. I don't know how intentional it is. I have no idea if it's intentional at all. If there's any like semblance of connection on the director's part, but it certainly touches on a lot of similar themes. And Herzog, as we kind of spoke about it way back, is kind of the king of this idea of like fact versus truth. That he will,
Yeah.
even in his documentaries, make up very blatant, basically lies about certain elements that actually end up representing the truth of the emotional
The
truth of
aesthetic
a
truth.
moment,
The aesthetic
and
truth.
yeah, the
Yeah.
aesthetic
Yep.
truth much better than presenting a factual
Just
retelling of a
an
certain situation. Or
accountant's an
yeah,
accountant's ledger of facts.
yeah.
Right.
And so I think
Right.
that that's one of the things that you get with this is that I'm sure if I read the diaries of Richard Evan Schultz and Theodore Koch Grunberg, who are their real names, I'm sure
Nice.
that I
Nice.
would find very interesting stories. I'm sure the stories are rich with
Sure.
like incredible anecdotes and stories about these journeys. However, does it get to in those very, non-fictional kind of ways, does it get to the actual heart of
Mm.
what these events meant to the people that experienced them? I don't know, maybe, but I also think that your job as a filmmaker, and I think that Ciro Guerra did a great job with this, is to get to that emotional heart and to you know, I think this film has been deservedly lauded by both, critics worldwide, but also the indigenous tribes that it portrays, or at least in part portrays, because of that nuance, because it doesn't just present it as such a two-dimensional,
Mm.
classical tale of oh, the betrayal of X, Y,
Yeah.
and Z and all
Well,
this stuff. It shows it in so much more of the complexities and the tragedy, really, of trying to stop these situations where you kind of mentioned this earlier too, but you get this again, this almost opposite sides of the coin when Theo is trying to prevent them from keeping the compass, and you've got um, Karamakate telling them that you can't stop that. You can't stop that progress, despite the fact that in a
mhm.
grand scheme of things, they're actually kind of doing the opposite. That Theodore and Evan, at a later date, trying to find this kind of new passage for rubber to be exported to the United States, is almost bringing in that industry and bringing in that rapid cultural advancement and technological advancement in almost a culture shock kind of way, despite the fact that they kind of, in this very surface level sort of way, say like, oh no, I can't leave this compass there. Like the compass is small potatoes in
Mm.
the colonization and uprooting of the Amazon
Mhm.
by rubber
Sure,
plantations, and
sure,
yet this
sure.
one tiny thing is kind of so, expressly stressed on
Well,
by Theo. So I think that, yeah, it's just super well done in
yeah.
that kind of.
Well, and I think it's just, yeah, and it just, as we kind of wrap up here, I mean, I just think, sometimes, I mean, it's just the existential quagmire. If you, I don't even know if it's a quagmire, maybe it's just a soup, but the existential soup of just, all these things. It's just the world is just filled with living things trying to do what they know how to do, and it's just a it's a I mean, there's no way to there's no way to not understate this, but it's just humanity is just very challenging.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think, on just to kind of end on a note, it's like you talked about kind of the seeming parallels potentially, or at least superficially, to, like, something like Heart of Darkness. I will say that even though this film obviously illustrates a lot of horrors,
Yes. Yeah.
really, of course, they're horrors in the film, but they're horrors because so many of these things, and even worse, have actually happened, to countless people in real life, and that obviously is a profound horror. But the film finds a way, I think, to end not with darkness, but with light, and with hope,
Hmm.
and yeah. So right on, man. Well, I really, really enjoyed listening to your perspectives. Like you said, it's so fun to kind of hear, you kind of caused me to see things that I hadn't seen, or see them from different angles, and maybe hopefully vice versa.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
likewise you, and hopefully to an audience out there, as well. If you've not seen the film, please go see it. It's really a fantastic film. I couldn't recommend it more.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's available on a few. I think here it's available on Apple TV and a few different things. So pretty
Yeah.
easy to
Yep.
to access if you want to watch it. And I think we would both recommend it. I think that it's this conversation will probably make a lot more sense if you do watch it. So
Yeah, yeah,
I recommend it.
absolutely. And not that that's our thing, but two thumbs up apparently.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Well, Cullen, I look forward to your pick next time. And as always, really enjoyed our conversation. And to everyone out there, we thank you so much for listening. And until next time, we'll catch you on the flip side.
Bye bye.